the banking sector's policies have come under sharp scrutiny in Parliament today. The Standing Committee on Finance has questioned the sector's transformative agenda, with some members accusing the industry of excluding the majority of South Africans. Trade Industry Portfolio Committee Chairperson is Mzwandile Masina. He joins us from Cape Town this evening. Good evening, sir, and thank you very much for your time. Let's start with what prompted this meeting.
No, thank you very much to you and the listeners at home. Well, as part and parcel, as you know, that the government has got, the state has got three arms of government, which is the executive, the legislature, as well as the judiciary. So we've realized that there is a lot of work that we have not been doing to try as the legislature to ensure that we can support the work of the executive, but also to do independent oversight. You know that in the main, the banks are probably managed through the Prudential Authority under the Reserve Bank, and just to tick their boxes about their compliance with in terms of the Banking Act. But we've not really done a lot of work since 1994 to hold banks accountable with regard to issues of the consumers, which are the end users, which are affected by banking products in the main. So we then decided to, as a joint committee, to put a scrutiny and ensure that we can question them with regard to the two areas of work. Firstly, the consumption credit, as well as the credit for starting businesses. And we are very happy how the bank have responded in the main. They have really, honored the work of Parliament. They've came in there, frankly, made a representation. And we're, at the end of the meeting, we all agreed that we need some fundamental change in how the banking system is structured so that it can be responsive to the people of South Africa and ensure that they become the main beneficiaries beyond just paying deposits and getting salaries from the banks.
Yeah, and I want to latch on to that point because you have been vocal about what you say is the lack of transformation in South Africa's banking sector. To your mind, based on what you have heard today, what are the biggest barriers preventing the participation and inclusivity of broader South Africa, particularly those that were historically disadvantaged?
Look, I think the financial sector, like all other sectors in the main, in terms of the BEE Act, they have found a way in which they can just move around and give themselves level ones. When we ask them a specific question, to say, if you say you are Bank X, and then where is Mr. Mgambi, who's a BEE, who qualifies as number one? In the main, many of the banks that we spoke to today, they actually don't have that kind of a person. But in terms of how they've maneuvered within the codes itself, if they get rankings that they do not deserve. So we all agree that, look, more work must be done to ensure that there's transformation. But secondly, we then also agree that there has to be some legislative changes that will have to be proposed at some point once we've dealt with the entire value chain in the financial sector, because we need to engage the insurance, we need to engage the asset managers, we need to engage other critical subsectors in this area so that we can ultimately come up with what is going to help our economy to grow. Because at the end of the day, we cannot preside over this economy for the past 8 years that is not growing at the rate in which we expect. Which is why we pointed out to the banks that we can't have assets of almost 49 trillion rand, but we have half of the population not working. It's unheard of when they were able to demonstrate where those assets are located and so on and so on. So we did then emphasize the point that it would appear that we should have almost, if you like, a Davos with the financial sector almost on an annual basis to try and drill down into the issues that have not done very well. So the meeting was very cordial. The banks are happy, we are happy, and we think that there is a progress we can make in that regard.
Yeah. The Banking Association of South Africa, including the leaders within this industry, they often argue that progress is being made. Based on what you heard today, are you convinced, first of all, that indeed there is real progress being made, or you sense there is reluctance, perhaps even deliberate reluctance to real change?
Look, we run the best banking sector in South Africa, I must say, in terms of normal compliance with financial issues. But in terms of empowerment, we're able to, the entire a joint committee was able to point out that banks have not transformed. Banks are still using the same template they used during apartheid, so something has got to give. So, but we're not hostile to each other when we're raising those issues. We're factual. We're able to show that where there's been gap, and even ourselves, where there is a lacuna in law, we realize that there are certain areas that fundamentally will have to mobilize the entire parliament to ensure that we effect some changes so that the banks can comply in the true sense. But also, we need another mechanism to hold them accountable beyond just ticking the boxes of the prudential authorities.
Yeah. I want to ask this question as a follow-up to what I've just asked you. What policy changes or specific reforms do you believe are needed in order to almost force this change? And I'm asking you this question based on, yes, I know it was not a commercial bank, but VBS is history now. There were talks that it could potentially have been turned commercial had there not been the wholesale looting that happened. And then more recently, the example of Itala Bank. Do you believe that we will ever really achieve this inclusivity if these institutions, at least the ones that are seen as catering to the larger black community, keep folding?
Look, the reality is that in South Africa, for instance, we've got 3 different tiers of banking system. You've got the first tier, which is more your traditional commercial bank, then the second tier, which is more your mutual banks, and the third tier, which is more of your community banking and so on and so on. That includes stokvels and so on and so on. But what we have seen over the past 8 years is that the second tier and the third tier has not found it favorable in law to ensure that they can thrive. As a result, you can see with Itala, which was established in 1958, it could not find a mechanism. So that is why members of parliament were insisting that there is a parliamentary decision that Itala must be saved. And there was an engagement today that VBS must be saved and similar banks so that we can have new entrants into the banking system. In South Africa, we can't in 30 years continue to have just only 5 big banks plus one, which is the Capitec, that are doing almost 80-90% of the work in the banking sector. We've got to transform and open it up for new players to ensure that they can, and those players in the main will come, from the second and the third tier, including, the state banks and other things that we can do. So we really have had a very good conversation that we have to open up this industry and ensure that there are other players so that we broaden competition in the banking sector.
Yeah. The final question, I have to make reference to a specific member of the committee that asked this question. The member of parliament from the MK benches, Brian Molefe, making the submission about banks closing the accounts of some businesses and calling for a need for intervention. Do you go along with his thought process? Do you go along with his submission?
What was reported today is that about 312 banking accounts of individuals and firms have been closed. We have called for an open and transparent process, which is so that those people can be explained to. We were not really speaking for individuals in the main as the African National Congress or members of parliament. I fully agree that Tate Molefe, Tate van Rooyen, they were very steadfast on issues of Segunjalo. Unfortunately, we don't have the details. So all what we have done, in our capacities was to ensure that we want transparency in as far as those banks that are closed, their reasons, whether or not, but also we're beginning to now propose mechanism to say it can't be that the banks they can close and then close the account and they don't tell you, and there is no mechanism for you to appeal. So we are beginning to think about the appeal mechanism so that we can do that. Many of us, if I may say it, we are also victims of the banks. As identified as politically exposed people, it's difficult to open a bank account. It's difficult for our family members. and you get profiled and then you're excluded from the banking. We said all those things will now have to be raised quite sharply so that we can ensure that banking is open for all South Africans, and then so that no one is feel discriminated. So in the main, we really were speaking on behalf of all the 312 bank accounts that have been closed to say we want transparency and we want information to come forward so that all those people can know what are the reasons for the closures of their bank account. And also, and then another issue that was raised quite sharp is that there are people who have been found guilty of different crimes. Their bank accounts have not been closed. All those issues will now be following up as different portfolio committees, specifically with those individual banks where we know. I am certain that nothing will stop members of MK Party to ask whatever questions that they are much more vested with, so that we can find justice in the main.
Finally and briefly on this point, are you saying that it's not enough for banks to say they've picked up suspicious transactions and therefore they're going to close the accounts?
We say there has to be, if that's the case, they have to be transparent so that people know. If you close my bank account, for instance, my bank account will close in December for FICA. When I asked, they said, no, you only go there once in 5 years. It was a new bank account. It was closed and I could not get paid in January. And but I was told that the problem is FICA, and I was told that the system I must follow, the bank will have to write to a particular department, and my bank was open. Imagine if I was not told. It means even now I would not have been paid and I would not be able to take my kids to school. All what we're asking for is justice and openness and transparency in as far as the closing or not closing of bank accounts of individuals and firms.
Mzwandile Masina, thank you very much for your time.